Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Radlick. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Now, Australians have observed over the past decade a range of issues that have emerged as a result of how whistleblowers or people who tell stories that authorities don't want heard in the public square are being treated. Now, we've seen a range of cases from the former ATO staffer Richard Boyle to issues related to Witness K and lawyer Bernard Collaring. Joining me today is another individual embroiled in a similar case, or very much the same kind of case, as David McBride, who in his time released information related to concerns that he had about what was going on in Afghanistan some time ago. He's in the middle of a court case at the moment, but it's an absolute privilege to chat to him about that, as well as where the laws need to change in order to protect whistleblowers more. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, before we get into the substance of the issues that I know are on your mind, but also on the minds of the audience that read material about your case. Let's travel back in time for a moment.
Yep.
Where did your involvement in the military begin?
Well, I always wanted to be a soldier from an early age. They say what you want to be when you're 7 is what influences you. I wanted to be a soldier when I was 7, and it was quite unusual in that both my parents were doctors, and it was not really. My grandfather had been an Anzac on my father's side, but he wasn't a professional soldier. He signed up for the First World War. So yeah, there wasn't really history, and I went to law school first in Australia. Then I did another law degree at Oxford University, but I met some people from the British Army, and I joined the British Army in the late '80s. Uh, it encapsulated everything I wanted in my life. I believe we were fighting for democracy, the rule of law. We were manning the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, or Western the border of East and West Europe. I found that quite exciting. I did a tour of Northern Ireland, and I enjoyed my time in the British Army. I thought being part of an armed force of a Western democratic nation was a great honour, and it was a very important thing to be a part of. I returned to Australia in my late 30s, and I got a job as a lawyer. I got married. I had a sort of a much more desk-bound sort of life, I guess. I had a couple of kids, but I missed service to the army or service to the nation, and I rejoined the Australian Army as a lawyer, as a military officer, a legal officer, sorry, in the military. And I enjoyed that. It was a nice combination of being a lawyer and a soldier. And I still very much believed in the big picture that we were defending democracy, we were defending parliamentary rules, the United Nations security, the United Nations sort of rules, and I became concerned in my tours of Afghanistan that we were deviating from the sort of things we were meant to be protecting, that is democracy and truth, and we were becoming a far more sinister political force where the truth no longer mattered. We were being used to do public relations operations, information operations, as they called them, and we were getting further and further away from what I considered our role, was meant to be, rather than protecting parliamentary democracy and the rule of law and human rights in other countries, we were increasingly being used in effectively in the opposite to what I expected.
How can we? It's a convenient segue to um, the concerns you had uh, within the army, within the military about um, things that were going on. Um, Take me through the process of what happened, what happens internally in an organisation like uh, the Defence Force when somebody has a concern. What is the standard process that people follow?
There's a number of different processes, uh, and this is one of the problems we'll get to in relation to the Public Interest Disclosure Act. They're being more controlled by. And one of the problems you have is if you have a relatively big, well, it was a big issue complaint like I had, it tends to be looked at by the very people that you're complaining about. There's no independence. And I think Richard Boyle would have found the same thing. And I imagine Bernard Collaery a bit the same. Once you strike on a big issue, you do obviously have to make some sort of internal complaint first, but it's a very delicate process because you suspect that the people that you have to take this issue up with already know what it's about, and they've already made a conscious decision to take that conduct. It's not impossible that you can talk them out of it, but you have to do it relatively diplomatically, and human nature being what it is. People will generally get defensive. So I tried to be as diplomatic as I could. I was a relatively senior officer in the military. I was a lawyer, so I was capable of writing relatively diplomatic stuff, and so I took quite a long time to say, basically, to try to give him a gentle warning in the sense that from an inside the tent perspective, to say we could be exposing ourselves to greater criticism and greater risks by doing what we're doing. I can see that there may be short-term benefits, for example, in saying that we're winning the war when we're not. We can all understand why we all put out good news stories for short-term benefit. But you only lose your reputation once. And if we ever get caught out by the Australian public making stuff up, clearly making stuff up, saying that some people are heroes when we know that they're actually war criminals, giving them medals when we know there's huge question marks over them, having allies in our fight for Afghanistan who are actually drug dealers. If we get caught out putting out these bad messages, which we know to be untrue, the long-term damage to our reputation may be something that we not only, it'll be very hard for us to recover. And even if you just take it in a very selfish way, maybe some generals, etc., will their careers will be over, and maybe we would regret it. Anyway, I tried to put it in as diplomatic way as I could to say, are we sure that this policy of habitually putting out false messages is best for the organisation in the long run? And I guess there was half a chance, I thought, that they might say, We hear what you're saying. We did overextend ourselves a little bit. It was a war. There was a lot of pressure to get good political results. We may have put out the odd. We may have got a bit carried away with our false messaging, and therefore we might. We're going to take your advice, and we're going to take your point, give you a pat on the back, and say, yeah, in future we will we'll try to maybe not sail so close to the wind. However, that's not the response I got. Um, it If it is a big issue, yeah, it's not surprising. That is one of the reasons, and we'll probably touch on this more later. But to say we do need some sort of independent body, because any body, well, and we've seen through the Boyle case, we've seen through organisations don't like to be caught out by their own employees. They deny it. They come back with all guns blazing, and but had I had an independent, truly independent body to go to, I might have got a better response. But human nature is such as you end up becoming the enemy by saying, "Are you sure?" Even no matter how politely you do it.
Um, and that, of course, led to contact with people outside the organisation, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right, and I wasn't surprised. I grew up. I'm old enough to remember Watergate, uh, and I've always knew that it was likely to come to that situation where I would have to get uh, a good media person, a trusted media person with some clout, and explain to them, look, this is pretty bad. We're getting out of control, and get them to. I was hoping that I would be able to possibly do it anonymously, give them the information, and get them to print it a bit like the Watergate story. And then to get, once they got denials from the government, to be able to sort of prove those denials wrong because they had so much inside information, which I'd given to them. Uh, one of the things that's really changed since the 1970s is that it wasn't that easy to get uh, journalists who were effectively taking the government on, effectively taking the war and terror on. It was hard because it was a big story, and most, even the ABC, which is not a corporate uh, institution. I mean, it does get its money from the government, and it's a government institution, and it is actually part of the government. So, for them to run a really major anti-government story, would be like biting the hand that feeds them. So, not that easy to do. Um, so it wasn't easy to get her off the ground. And this is one of the problems when you are, and all the whistleblowers have found this. You need press support, but it's not necessarily that easy to get. For example, I mean, it's not a fair system where you have to convince the media that you're right. That was one of the problems I had. Some of it was quite technical. It was about international law. It was about messages which were highly classified, and it's a very unsatisfactory a situation where, in order for a journalist, in order for a whistleblower to survive, they have to be able to convince a journalist that they're right. Journalists, you're one of them yourself. You're one of the smarter ones, but I'm sure you'd agree that that's a bit of a tenuous situation. And again, if we had um, uh, a whistleblower authority, some sort of third party, and presumably they'd have experts in particular areas, it would be a little bit easier. But I struggled to get people who they could see some of my points, but they couldn't necessarily see them all. But eventually, I did get some journalists who were prepared to to run with the story, and that was um, it's an inexact science that began to get some sort of traction, and eventually there was an internal inquiry, the Burton report into war crimes. So there was uh, a bit like it's a bit like you're fighting when you're a whistleblower. You end up fighting your own war, and it's a bit like a war in that you have some battles you win, some battles you lose. You move towards an overarching goal, but it's not a particularly smooth process. And uh, that's all been a bit of a learning journey for me. But yes, I got the media. I got the media on side. We started to score some goals. I probably didn't really get all the traction that I wanted, ironically, till I was charged. I knew I would be, because I believed in what I was doing so strongly. That wasn't a barrier to me because I was always about getting change. And this is one of the problems that you have with the Public Interest Disclosure Act. That looks at whether or not you should be charged. But that was never my goal. I was never trying to avoid going to jail per se. I was trying to get change in what I saw as a very corrupt Australian government system, where all the departments, the Defence Department included, were focused on putting out good news messages that would make the minister popular rather than focused on their core job, like protecting Australia. I saw it as a big problem. I wanted change on that big problem. And I wasn't trying to avoid jail, I was trying to get change. Uh, and so this was one of the issues I was going to have. Even when we looked at my case under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, the judge would have said to me, "Yeah, Major McBride, you didn't tick all the boxes for the Public Interest Disclosure Act," and I would have been like, "Yes, Your Honour, I understand that, but I wasn't trying to avoid jail. I was actually trying to get change." For example, one of the things, the Public Interest Disclosure Act has become quite prescriptive, and they say you've got to wait until the internal inquiry mechanism has come to an end before you can see the media. Now that seems reasonable enough. It's a new act, but of course, in order to make things difficult for you, if the government suspect you're going to become a whistleblower, they could draw out that internal inquiry process for 2 years. And under the act, that means you can't go to the media for 2 years, and that could mean that's very frustrating. If in my case they drew it out for a full year, and in that full year, I'd already seen the media. And the reason I saw a guy called Chris Masters, um, and he's obviously a very reputable journalist. He's taken on governments before, and I
Hmm.
thought he would be the right person to see. Um, but that me seeing Chris Masters before the end of the internal inquiry that year would mean I wouldn't be eligible for protection under the Act. And another thing that is quite prescriptive in the Act is that you must see the correct public interest disclosure delegate, and the organisation gets to decide who that delegate. And one of the when we were having my hearing, which was since abandoned, one of the questions that was going to be argued was not so much the merits of my case, not so much that whether or not they were covering up war crimes, but whether the person that I'd seen, and they accepted that I had complained to a person in the organisation, but whether or not they were the correct public interest disclosure delegate for myself. And so it's a bit like, really, why would we why wouldn't we argue the substantive issues? And of course, the government department, in my case, the Defence Force, get to argue hard about the fact that I saw the wrong person. Uh, and it's quite hard for us to argue against them on that point. But they get quite a few free kicks to avoid the substantive issues and just argue over minutiae about you didn't complain to the right person, you complained too early. Um, and as we saw in my case, the ultimate one to say you can't use any of the information in your case because it's all covered it's all classified, and therefore the judge is not even allowed to see it. So the government departments get to play a lot of interference to stop people using the act, even and let alone look at the substantive issues.
There is something you said earlier um, in your response that I want to come back to. Um, you mentioned that you had a bit of a thought about the Watergate situation in dealing with in how you might approach that. Yeah, how influential was that Watergate scenario in your thinking?
Yeah, it was very influential. I thought it was the same thing. I thought, and I've said this before uh, in summaries, I didn't see it as the My Lai massacre. I didn't see it so much as a war. Particular the war crimes were a symptom of a larger problem. I saw it as Watergate. I believed it was a cover up. I believe it probably. I don't know if it went to the Prime Minister, but it certainly went to the Defence Minister, and it's hard to believe it wouldn't have gone to the Prime Minister, where they'd made a conscious decision to say, we know there are war crimes going on, we know our most famous soldier is involved, therefore we have too much to lose by having an investigation. It's unpopular. What we will do is we'll kick it down the track for as long as we can. In the meantime, in order to get journalists off our back, uh, we'll look for scapegoats of less famous soldiers, and we'll put them on trial in order to keep the journalists off our back. I think that's what happened. And I needed a very clued up journalist. This is why Chris Masters appealed to me. I needed someone who would have had connections within government, because I couldn't see the full story. I could only see the uniform side of it. I needed some sort of intel from what was happening in the minister's office, whether any incriminating conversations were recorded by staffers, that they knew there were some big issues, and that things needed to be covered up, and this was a plan. So yeah, I wanted that. I wanted someone like Masters, or in fact like Bernstein and Woodward, to start asking questions of the government and seeing if they could pin them down in like a game of chess or a game of battleships and say, did you know this? Did you know that? And as they gave their answers, they could start saying, hang on, we've pinned you into the fact that that can't be true. Unfortunately, we've learned a lot of bad lessons since the 70s. To a certain extent, there's been negative evolution in politics and war, and we don't have press conferences anymore where you can pin the government down with those hard questions. Like I imagine they only ever answer questions when they want to. They don't, and if it's too hard, they don't answer questions, and they have a lot of people doing their public affairs, and that was naivety on my part to think that they could be trapped like that. I was hoping that the journalists would be able to do the heavy lifting with the documents, but saying that, I wasn't afraid of having to face the music myself. All the journalists who took documents off me were very good, and they said, you understand you are at great risk, because it won't be that hard for the Department of Defence to find you. And I was
Yep.
like, yes, I understand that, but I think this is so important, um, that I'm prepared. If while I don't want to, to to jump straight into the fire, because I that won't achieve anything. I'm trying to actually get results here. But if I have to show my face, if I have to own it in order to get results, I will do so, because I believe it was a continuation of my military duty, in that I'd sworn on a Bible in front of an Australian flag to do everything I could, uh, to basically uphold the laws of this country. Um, and I believe that I was doing that, and I also believed it would be a bit of a cop out if I didn't, uh, wasn't prepared to front up and take, some sort of sacrifice, in order to uphold those laws and in order to do what was right. So, um, I was angry as much as anything, and if someone had to, face the music, I was prepared to do it.
Uh, One of the things in a discipline that I am very familiar with, being audit, is that uh, you know, auditors do not audit their own work. One of the points you've made in this discussion so far is that uh, in the process of public interest disclosures, and in the way in which that operates, departments, uh, in your case, defence, tend to or could be seen to be auditing their own work because it's being dealt with inside the tent rather than through an independent um, perspective, or an ombudsman, if you like, um, which is a convenient kind of segue to the issue that I think is germane to the whole discussion. What must change to make the public interest disclosure laws uh, better, in your view?
Yes, it's an interesting problem. I don't. We The act is almost worse than a failure, because there must be some sort of common law principle that says, you are allowed to go to the media if, the department you are working for is breaking the law, or some such thing. And they would have to weigh up the potential damage, any potential damage from the release of the information over the potential, breach of the law. Now, but by trying to codify these into an act, we seem to have really made a pig's ear of it, because, uh, the codification, requires, it gives the government departments so much more power over, whether you report it to the right person, uh, whether you whether you made any kind of complaint, um, outside of your chain of command, within the right time frame. Now, these are things which wouldn't necessarily be looked at under the common law. They would really, the judge would be able to make those decisions, and the judge alone would be able to say, it was a reasonable thing to do in the circumstances, rather than having to look at the very prescriptive things, uh, which are in the acts, like did they complain to the right delegate? Did they complain, within the right time frame? Yeah, the more complicated the act, uh, has become, the less useful it is to whistleblowers who may have really done the right thing on a key issue. One of the things the act doesn't look at is how dangerous was the conduct being complained about. You could be complaining about the Holocaust or nuclear waste being dumped in, Warragamba Dam. There are when you've got an extreme circumstance like that, it shouldn't be the case that you could be, tripped up due to technicalities. I think one of the key things is we need to have an some sort of independent body, because organisations shouldn't be allowed to, as you said, audit themselves. They shouldn't be allowed to rule on the virtues or not of whistleblowers within their own organisation, because if they can, there will always be a tendency for them to say this person's not worthy, this person's not within the realms. Uh, that is human nature. But some sort of third party uh, who could at least put it in the ballpark, and that would be better in the long run, because that would also save people like me uh, having to go to the media, because especially with the classified documents, if had there been some sort of third party, trusted third party, I could have taken the documents to them. There would have been no leaking to the media, and they would have been able to look at it behind closed doors. That is obviously the best way to go. It's hard. The fact that the Labor government have talked a very good game on whistleblowers, but still uh, haven't backed a whistleblower protection authority, even in some sort of relatively lukewarm way, I think it can only be an indicator of bad faith, because what have they got to lose, really? And this is one of the shames. The government has got nothing to lose from good government, basically, which is what whistleblowers will bring. And we should be promoting it, because we are only, all people like myself and Boyle, Kaleri, Australia could only be better if the sort of things we talked about were fixed. And it wouldn't be bad for the government. It would only be good for the government if corrupt practices in various departments were cleared up. And it's a shame that they don't see that, and they don't back us a little bit more wholeheartedly, as if we are the enemy, when we're not the enemy of good government. We're actually the friend of good government.
I think a point that is also worth raising, and this is something that I talked to with a couple of people a lot, and yeah, anyone that's a whistleblower enters into what sociologists, and one in particular, um, call sort of morally disengaged environment. Um, how much of that kind of thinking have you sort of done in terms of how government operates?
Yeah, well, I was quite surprised by it, and uh, since my own experience, I was off sick with a post-traumatic stress disorder. I was eventually discharged from the Defence Force. Anyway, I've had about 5 years where I've read a lot more about the various different cases, and I can see that there are similarities. And this is one of the advantages we've got with Richard Ball's case and Bernard Caleri's case, and even the ones that have come before, like Jeff Morris with the Banking Royal Commission,
Yeah.
uh, and, and one that I found particularly interesting was Peter Fox, who the detective who helped get the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse. That his story has real similarities to my own, in that he started to uncover things, and it was shut down, and he was actually shut down, and then he did it on his own, And then senior detectives or senior police officers wouldn't say it was raided. They unofficially raided his office and looked for his files, and so they could destroy them. Uh, there seems to be an us versus them mentality, uh, the moral disengagement. Yeah, it's surprising how when people start to work for an organisation, and even though, like me, they've been to the same schools, they've been to the same uh, lectures on law and morality and ethics, despite that, uh, they seem to want to band together and attack anybody who is a dissenter from the organisation. Yeah, it seems to. I was quite surprised by the moral disengagement that I didn't find any, very few friendly faces in the higher echelons. It seemed to be uniformly people who saw me as some sort of enemy, uh, and who I had to be crushed at all costs. And it was, yeah, it's a very psychology. The psychology of it is fascinating, and how that happens when we've actually all done the same training. They're all meant to want to do the right thing, and yet that doesn't seem to be the way it works. And as I said, it's one of the, if you want to be a successful whistleblower, you've really got to put a lot of thought into psychology. Uh, of people, of organization, because it's, yeah, I was surprised how what a united front I came up against, and how people didn't seem to, even though they'd done the same training I've done, they did not see things the same way I did, and that was a surprise for me.
It's an interesting point you raise because the illustration that comes to mind is, there are um, uh, there's a kind of a pack mentality that people wouldn't think humans are capable of. Um, but whistleblowers seem to be subjected to a pack mentality within an organisation.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened. And even though I was surprised by it, there's no doubt that's what happens once you become, even people who were relatively sympathetic beforehand, fellow lawyers who could see the points I was trying to make. Once I actually became a whistleblower, it was a pack mentality against me. Maybe it's because people who have some sort of a guilt feeling that they knew as much as I did. Maybe they thought in their heart, maybe they could have, should have said more, should have done something, but uh, they do become a pack mentality, and they do really pretty much turn against you universally. It is hard because you also, if you're someone like me who was a soldier and enjoyed being a soldier, uh, you when you get out of that organization and you lose your sense of identity, you struggle because you're not really a soldier anymore. You're kind of you have to tell yourself you are a soldier and you're fighting for the beliefs, and you're very much still a soldier, but it is hard, and you are, because you don't realize how much you lose your sense of identity. So I guess the flip side of that is that people uh, have this sense of identity, and maybe that's why they adapt such a pack mentality against you.
And David, you've been extremely generous with your time. What I do want to do is ask you to, I guess, nominate a site or anything. If people want to know more about you and your case, where would they find information online?
I've got a website, davidmcbride.com.au. I'd be very grateful for people to have a look at that. I've got an Instagram, David Bird McBride, and I've got I'm on Twitter, Murdoch Cadell, and I've got a GoFundMe to help Major David McBride with his fight for justice. But I'm very grateful for you. Crikey, you've been a particularly, you do so many good stories, and I'm really, I can't tell you the strength that I get from speaking to intelligent people with a little bit of insight. It's like water in the desert. And so, yeah, thank you very much for your work.
And thank you so much for your time today, because I know you've probably got a lot of things to think about.
I've got to think about boxing training again. Yeah.
Okay. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Good to speak.